the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. I never thought I'd be afraid of the house next door, but that was before he moved in the first time I saw him. I was watering my front lawn. The moving truck had just pulled away, leaving behind a trail of dust and the faint scent of diesel. I watched as he emerged from his new home, a tall figure. Silhouetted against the fading evening light, he stood there for a moment, motionless, before his head slowly turned in my direction. I raised my hand in a friendly wave, ready to introduce myself. But he didn't wave back, he just stared. Even from across the street, I could feel the intensity of his gaze it made. My skin prickle like I was being dissected under a microscope. After what felt like an eternity, he abruptly turned and went back inside the door, closing with a definitive click. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. He's probably just shy, I told myself, focusing on the cool water spraying over my hands as I adjusted the hose nozzle, moving his stress full. He'll warm up eventually, but he didn't. Days passed and I barely saw him leave the house. The curtains in his front windows remained drawn, but sometimes when I was getting the mail or heading to my car, I'd catch a glimpse of movement behind them, a shadow, shifting the fabric, twitching ever so slightly. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but I was paying attention. I couldn't help it. It was about a week after he moved in that I first noticed him watching me from his window. I was in my kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when something made me look up there. He was standing in his front window, eyes locked on me. I nearly sliced my fingers, startled by his sudden appearance. I gave an awkward wave, trying to be neighborly, despite the growing knot in my stomach. He didn't wave back, he didn't move at all. He just kept staring, his face a blank mask. I turned away, focusing on the carrots in front of me, the steady rhythm of my knife against the cutting board. When I looked back up, he was gone. But that was just the beginning. Soon it seemed like every time I looked out a window or stepped outside, he was there watching, sometimes from behind his curtains, sometimes openly standing at his window. Once I woke up in the middle of the night and saw him in his front yard, just standing there, staring at my house. I quickly closed my curtains, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it from across the street. I started changing my routines, trying to be unpredictable. I'd leave for work at different times and take various routes home. But somehow he always seemed to know, no matter when I left or returned there. He'd be eyes following my every move. I considered talking to him, confronting him about his behavior, but something held me back. Maybe it was the coldness in his eyes or the way his presence seemed to suck all the warmth out of the air. Whatever it was, every instinct I had screamed at me to stay away. As the days turned into weeks, his behavior grew more erratic. I'd hear strange noises coming from his house at all hours, banging, scraping, sometimes what sounded like muffled shouting, when once I could have sworn I heard a woman crying. But when I strained to listen closer, the sound abruptly cut off. I started losing sleep, jumping at every sound, constantly checking and rechecking my locks. My friends noticed the change in me, commenting on the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden movements. I brushed off their concerns, not sure how to explain that I was being terrorized by someone who hadn't actually done anything. Then came the night that changed everything. I was up late, unable to sleep as usual. The house was quiet. The only sound, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on my nightstand. I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself from the gnawing anxiety in my gut, when I heard a creak coming from downstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It could have been nothing. Houses make noise all the time, right? But then I heard it again, louder this time. Unmistakable. Someone was in my house. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, ready to call 911. But before I could dial, my bedroom door slowly began to open. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to spring into action. The door swung open, revealing nothing, just the dark hallway beyond. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, that the stress and lack of sleep had finally made me crack. But then I saw a shadow moving across my bedroom floor. I tracked its progress with wide eyes, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. The shadow stopped at the foot of my bed and slowly, so slowly began to rise. It took shape, forming into a tall, familiar silhouette him. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just lay there paralyzed as he loomed over me in the dim light filtering through my curtains. I could just make out the glint in his eyes, the twist of his mouth. "Hello, neighbor," he said, his voice low and grayly, I think. "It's time we had a proper introduction, don't you?" I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as he reached into his pocket, pulling out something that caught the light, a knife. You see, he continued running his finger along the blade. "I've been watching you for a while now, learning your habits, your routines. It's amazing what you can learn about a person just by observing." He took a step closer, and I could smell him now, a mix of sweat and something metallic like blood. But observation can only tell you so much. To really know someone, you have to get closer. The knife hovered inches from my face, and I could see my terrified reflection in its polished surface. This was it. I thought, this is how I die. But just as the tip of the blade touched my cheek, a bright light flooded the room, car headlights sweeping across my windows as a vehicle turned onto our street. The sudden illumination seemed to startle him, and he took a step back, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening I needed. With a surge of adrenaline, I launched myself out of bed, shoving past him with all my strength. He stumbled, caught off guard, and I heard the knife clatter to the floor. I didn't look back, just ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps thundering down the steps. My lungs burned as I sprinted for the front door, fumbling with the lock with shaking hands. Just as I got it open, I felt his hand close around my arm, yanking me back. "No," I screamed, twisting in his grip. "Let me go." We grappled in the doorway, his strength threatening to overpower me. But desperation lent me strength I didn't know I had. I clawed at his face, my nails raking across his cheek. He howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I burst out onto my front lawn, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. Lights began to flick on in neighboring houses, curious faces appearing in windows. He stood in my doorway, blood trickling down his face where I'd scratched him, his eyes wild with rage. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both panting heavily. Then, as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, he turned and ran, not back into my house, but across the street to his own. I watched dumbfounded as he disappeared inside the door. Slamming behind him, the police arrived minutes later, finding me huddled on my front lawn, shaking uncontrollably. They listened to my story with grave expressions, immediately calling for backup to surround his house. But when they broke down his door, they found nothing. The house was completely empty, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate anyone had ever lived there at all. I insisted that I hadn't imagined it, showing them the scratches on my arm where he grabbed me. They believed me. The signs of a struggle in my house were clear, but they were baffled. How could someone just vanish like that? As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, I watched the police comb through his house. They found no trace of him, no clue to his identity or where he might have gone. It was like he had never existed. But I knew he had. I could still feel his eyes on me, still smell that metallic scent. And as I looked up at his empty house, a chill ran down my spine, because there in the upstairs window, I saw a curtain twitch, just slightly, just enough. He was still watching. And I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The house next door stood silent and dark, keeping its secrets for now. But somewhere out there, my neighbor was waiting, watching, and I knew that one day, when I least expected it, he would be back to finish what he started. The forest was supposed to be my escape. Instead, it became my prison. I've always been a solitary person, preferring the company of trees and wildlife to the chaos of city life. So, when the stress of my job started to overwhelm me, I knew exactly what I needed: a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness. Just me, my tent, and the great outdoors. If only I'd known what was waiting for me out there. The hike in was beautiful. Autumn had painted the forest in a riot of reds and golds, and the crisp air filled my lungs with each breath. As I treed deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was perfect. I found an ideal spot to set up camp just as the sun was starting to dip below the tree line, a small clearing next to a babbling stream sheltered by a stand of old-growth pines I pitched my tent with, practiced ease, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, I sat by my campfire watching the flames dance and listening to the forest around me. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow through the branches overhead. I felt the tension of the past few months melting away. This, I thought, was exactly what I needed. If only I'd known how wrong I was. The first sign that something was off came just after the midnight. I'd been dozing lightly in my tent when a sound jolted me awake. It was hard to place at first, a sort of scraping mixed with what almost sounded like whispers. I sat up, straining my ears. There it was, again, closer this time. My heart rate picked up as I unzipped the tent flap, peering out into the moonlit clearing. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just shadows and silver light. But then movement caught my eye. Something was moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Something big. I held my breath, watching as a dark shape seemed to detach itself from the shadows. It moved in a way that was wrong. Not quite human, not quite animal, just wrong. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. I sat there for what felt like hours, eyes fixed on that spot, barely daring to breathe, but nothing else emerged. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I managed to drift into an uneasy sleep. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, nothing to worry about. The forest plays tricks on you at night, after all. But when I woke the next morning, I knew it hadn't been my imagination. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a rank, musty odor that hadn't been there the night before. It reminded me of wet fur and something rotting. I unzipped. My tent was shaking, hands dreading what I might find. The clearing looked different. In the harsh light of day, branches had been broken on. The trees surrounding my campsite, far too high up to have been done by any normal animal. Deep gouges marred the trunks, like something with massive claws had been sharpening them. But it was what I found around my tent that truly chilled me to the bone. Footprints, dozens of them, circling my tent. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, with long curved claw marks at the ends of each toe. They hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. Whatever had made those prints had been inches from me. While I slept, my instincts screamed at me to pack up and get out of there. But a quick check of my phone showed no signal, and I knew I was at least a day's hike from the nearest road I was stuck at least until I could make it back to civilization. I spent the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound and shadow. I tried to convince myself that it was just some large animal, maybe a bear that had gotten curious about my campsite, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't leave footprints like that. Bears don't move the way that thing had moved. As the sun began to set, my anxiety ratcheted up to almost unbearable levels. I didn't want to be there when night fell again, but I had no choice. I was too far from safety to risk hiking out in the dark. I built my fire up bigger than the night before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As the flames crackled and popped, I huddled close, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement just at the edge of the firelight. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. For a moment, I thought I saw a face peering out at me from behind a tree, but it was like no face I'd ever seen before, elongated, with eyes that reflected the firelight like a cat's. And the teeth, God, the teeth! I blinked, and it was gone, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Sleep was out of the question. I stayed up all night feeding the fire and watching the shadows. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement or hear that strange scraping sound again, but whatever was out there kept at distance, content to watch and wait. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, but alive and more determined than ever to get out of there. I packed up my camp in record time, not bothering to be neat or thorough. I just wanted to be gone. As I shouldered my backpack and prepared to leave, something on the ground caught my eye. There, half hidden under a fallen leaf, was a small, polished stone. I wouldn't have noticed it if the sun hadn't glinted off surface. Curious, despite my fear, I picked it up. It was smooth and black, with strange symbols etched into its surface. Symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this was no natural formation. Someone or something had left this here deliberately. I dropped the stone like it had burned me and started walking my pace just short of a run. I didn't know what that thing was or what it meant, but I knew I didn't want any. Part of it, the hike back, was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat I could have. Sworn I heard footsteps behind me more than once. But when I turned to look, there was never anything there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead and saw my car that I allowed myself to relax slightly. I was safe. I had made it out, or so I thought. It's been 3 weeks since that camping trip, and I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight. When I turn to look, it's gone. I've been having dreams, 2 terrible dreams of running through an endless forest, pursued by something I can't see but can feel, getting closer with every step. I wake up drenched in sweat, the scent of wet fur and decay lingering in my nostrils. But the worst part, the part that makes me think I might truly be losing my mind this morning. I found something on my doorstep, a small polished black stone with shifting symbols etched on its surface, identical to the one I'd found in the forest. I don't know how it got there. I don't know what it means, but I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that whatever I encountered in those woods has followed me home, and I'm afraid that next time a campfire won't be enough to keep it at bay. The forest was supposed to be my escape. Instead, it brought something back with me, something that's watching, waiting, and I don't think it's going to leave me alone until it gets what it wants. The moment I saw his smile, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake, but by then, it was already too late. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway, broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights catching a road sign or the eyes of some nocturnal creature. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and fatigue was starting to set in. I should have stopped at that motel a few miles back, but I was determined to make it home tonight. That determination would prove to be my undoing. It started with a sputter, then a cough from the engine. I frowned, tapping the fuel gauge with my finger. It read half full, but something was clearly wrong. The car lurched, then began to slow. No matter how hard I pressed the accelerator. No, 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 I muttered, guiding the failing vehicle to the shoulder of the road. With a final pathetic wheeze, the engine died. Completely, I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, as if sheer willpower could restart the car. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the tick, tick, tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. Pulling out my phone, I cursed. Under my breath, no signal. Of course, I popped the hood and got out the cool night air, raising goosebumps on my arms. I shined my phone's flashlight into the engine compartment, but it may as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the sense it made to me. I'm no mechanic. And in that moment, I'd never felt more helpless. That's when I saw the headlights approaching in the distance. Release thief washed over me. Another car meant help, or at least the possibility of a ride to the nearest town. I waved my arms, hoping to catch the driver's attention. The vehicle, an old pickup truck I could see now, slowed as it approached. It pulled up behind me, headlights bathing my broken-down car in harsh light. I squinted, trying to make out the driver, but could only see a silhouette. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and worn jeans. As he approached, I could see he was older, maybe in his 50s, ran with graying hair and a scruffy beard. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice growly but not unkind. I nodded, gesturing helplessly at the open hood. "Yeah, it just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about engines?" He chuckled, moving past me to peer into the engine compartment. "I've been known to tinker now and then. Let's take a look." I watched as he leaned in, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who knew what they were doing. After a few minutes, he straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Well, good news and bad news," he said, turning to face me. "Good news is, I think I know what's wrong. Bad news is, it's not something I can fix here on the side of the road." My heart sank. "So what do I do?" He seemed to consider for a moment, then said, Tell you what, I can give you a tow to my place. I've got a workshop there. We can take a proper look in the morning. It's not far, I hesitated. Every instinct told me to be cautious of strangers, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But what choice did I have? That's really kind of you, I said slowly. Are you sure it's not too much? Trouble? That's when he smiled and something in my gut twisted. It wasn't an unkind smile, not exactly, but there was something off about it, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. No trouble at all, he said, still smiling that unsettling smile, always happy to help a stranger in need. Before I could respond, he was already moving to hook up my car to his truck. I stood there torn between relief at the offer of help and a growing sense of